Pronouns replace nouns. We know this from the first day of class. Replacing nouns can be useful so that we don't fall into the same repetitive structures throughout a paper. Ever find yourself writing the same person's name over and over again? Well, the pronoun can help you replace that name every once in a while. Pronouns, when used correctly, can help you develop more cohesive and varied papers. When they're used incorrectly, however, they can wreak havoc on your work. Obviously, the goal is to avoid this problem, and I'm hoping that this clip will help you navigate these issues. To simplify pronouns in their most basic form or definition, all you have to know is that there are two kinds of pronouns, broadly speaking, the subject pronoun and the object pronoun. Subject pronouns are what we're going to deal with first. They refer to the main noun in the sentence. Examples of subject pronouns include I, you, he, she, it, one, we, you, and they. Subject pronouns replace the main actor in the sentence. They are performing the action in that sentence. For example, if I say that Francine is performing as the primary villain in tonight's show, I could follow it up by replacing Francine with she. Watch how this works. I would say Francine is performing as the primary villain in tonight's show. She has the experience necessary to succeed. The pronoun she in this case replaces the noun Francine. Conversely, object pronouns relate to the subject, what the subject acts upon. Remember that objects are often introduced by prepositions. We'll go over this again in class, but prepositions are included in another video that we've already covered. Object pronouns include words like me, you, him, her, us, and them. For example, I could say that Pablo is dealing with a lot of work. The stress is starting to get to him. In this case, him replaces Pablo in the second sentence, but because it follows the preposition to, Pablo is actually the object being acted upon by stress, so it is now an object pronoun. All of this is just a complicated way of saying that there are two types of pronouns. The subject, which includes I, you, he, she, it, one, we, you, and they, which typically show the main action or the main actor in the sentence, versus object pronouns, which include me, you, him, her, us, or them, which often get acted upon by the subject in the sentence. Pronoun usage can get a little bit more complicated. In cases where there is a comparison, for example, you must decide what you want the pronoun to accord with. I could say, Sylvia is more likely to ask Dan to the party than I am, which means that I'm not as likely as Sylvie to ask Dan to the party. But we can change the context by saying, Sylvia is likely going to ask me to the party over him. Now we have two object pronouns in this second sentence, me and him. They both are followed by prepositions, and the sense of the sentence has completely changed. Whereas the first sentence, Sylvie is more likely to ask Dan to the party than I am, we're relating to who's going to ask Dan to the party, or who is more likely to ask Dan to the party. In this case, though, it's who is Sylvie more likely to ask. Very different context. This brings me to context, which we're talking about a lot in class and what we're going to talk about frequently over and over again when we get back to class. All of this depends on the context in which you're writing. Everything depends on context. That's why it's so important to establish that early on. This last sentence has two object pronouns as both people are being asked something. This all brings me to the pronoun antecedent rule. It's very similar to the subject-verb rule, but it's dealing with pronouns and nouns rather than verbs and nouns or subjects. A pronoun must accord in person and in number with the noun that it replaces. The same as when we were talking about subject-verb, where the verb and the noun had to accord in person and number, the pronoun and the person or the noun that it's replacing must accord in the same way. So the example of this is the name Sylvie in the previous examples. Sylvie is typically a woman's name, and it's singular. Therefore, the pronoun must also be singular. We can have she, her, or hers to replace it, but nothing else really. Conversely, something like the noun members would need to be according with something that is plural. So we would have them, theirs, they, or their as the pronoun to replace that name. This is best illustrated by an example such as James walked out of the store without paying the cashier. They are in hot pursuit of him right now. Or something like James walked out of the store without paying the cashier. They are now going to prison. In this case, we're not sure who they is in context. In the first sentence, they could refer to the cashier, but it could also refer to James, just the way that people often write. They is not typically used and should not be used to replace a masculine name such as James when gender is established. But sometimes those mistakes happen, and they happen quite a bit in your papers. The cashier, which may not have a gender, could be replaced by they. However, sometimes in context we will have already referred to a gender with the cashier or the cashier's name. In that case, they cannot be replaced. We'll get into this a little bit more later in the clip. In the second one, though, it can get quite complicated. So James walked out of the store without paying the cashier. They are now going to prison. Who are they? We've already established that James is a male. The cashier isn't necessarily going to prison, or that doesn't make sense in context. So we have to clarify exactly what we mean by they. The first one can be replaced quite easily. I can say, James walked out of the store without paying the cashier. The cashier is in hot pursuit of him right now. We know that him refers to James, and then we've re-established the context by repeating the cashier. We don't always want to repeat the same words, but in complicated circumstances like this, we do need to re-establish that context to make sure that we're being clear. The second one can be a little more complicated again. James walked out of the store without paying the cashier. He is now going to prison is one way that you can change that context. He is referring to James very clearly. The cashier can stand on his own or her own. Indefinite pronouns such as everyone, something, anyone, anybody, anything, or everybody, nobody, etc. all refer to a group of people, but they are singular because they refer to that group. The best example that I can give of this is that if anybody decides to go to college or university, she or he must be prepared to work extremely hard throughout the semester. Now, I want to add a caution here, I suppose. This all can be quite slippery, particularly if people do not identify with the predominant gender categories that we have in society. In these cases, they is acceptable only if a gender has not been clearly established. If we have established a male or female gender or another gender, this identification must accord with the pronoun. Usually this is quite clear based on the context of the paper or the context in which we are writing. So you'll be able to figure this out quite quickly. For the most part, we need to just remember that pronouns must agree with the nouns that come before. A singular noun does not warrant a plural noun. For example, the name Mark, which is typically masculine, cannot be replaced by they. It must be replaced by he. You will also want to be wary of vagueness. An example like Ryan told Jacob that he was going to have to shape up or get out of his house can be quite unclear because we don't know who he is. Whose house is it? In this case, we can easily fix the issue by eliminating a pronoun. In this case, what we're going to get as the replacement is that Ryan told Jacob that he was going to have to shape up or get out of the house. There's no more vagueness here. We now know that he refers to Jacob, and although the house is more generic and we do not know exactly whose house it is, the context of the sentence still suggests that Ryan is in a position of authority, and it's implied or inferred that Ryan is the owner of the house or has some sort of control over the house. This means that we don't have to overuse pronouns and that we have developed a more cohesive sentence as a result. The last thing that I want to get across is something that is tricky and that people often get incorrect, where it's mostly based on confusion, I think. So this is who versus whom. When do we use which? Well, quite simply, if it relates to the subject, use who. If it relates to the object, insofar as it follows a preposition, use whom. Here are a couple of examples for you. It was Madison who drew the winning ticket for the raffle and to whom the prize was awarded. Here we have who relating to the subject Madison, and the preposition to relating to the object, which is the prize. This means that whom is more suitable for this context. The second example is this. The trip's promoters were willing to settle for whomever they could get on short notice. In this case, whomever is introducing the object of desire for the subject, the promoters. This rule has shifted a bit as time has worn on, but the general idea still applies when we're writing and communicating, especially in formal contexts. We have tended to drop whom from regular discourse when we're speaking to each other, but this does not mean that it isn't still relevant or that it doesn't sound more formal and in often cases better than the more colloquial ways that we refer to things. There are contexts, particularly formal ones, where this rule is quite significant, academia being one of them. The goal with this lesson is to improve how you guide your reader through the conversation that you are putting forth in your paper. Pronouns can be difficult, but a little bit of attention and practice can go a long way to helping you master the art of cohesion. Thanks for listening.